Imagine waking up tomorrow morning, looking out your window, and just finding a massive foreign army at your front door.
Right, just a total nightmare scenario.
Exactly. And the commander, he doesn't just want your money. He knocks and calmly informs you that your entire family, and basically everyone in your city are going to pack up whatever you can carry.
Which is probably not much.
Yeah, barely anything. And you're going to walk, I don't know, 500 miles into the desert to build a brand new palace for a king you have literally never met.
And if you say no?
Oh, if you resist, it's not just a quick death. You will be flayed alive in the town square.
Yeah, skinned alive. Just brutal.
Just absolutely horrifying. But the crazy thing is, this wasn't some dystopian sci-fi nightmare. If you were a person living in the ancient Near East around, say, 800 BCE, this was just Tuesday. I mean, this was the day-to-day reality of dealing with the Assyrian Empire.
It really was. And the sheer scale of the disruption they caused, it's genuinely hard for the modern mind to fully grasp. We are talking about a civilization that fundamentally re-engineered the demographics, the economy, and really the psychology of the ancient world.
Yeah.
And they did it with this level of calculated, almost bureaucratic precision that just feels totally out of place for a society operating thousands of years before the Industrial Revolution.
That is exactly what makes the stack of research and source material we're looking at today so incredibly fascinating.
Right.
Because we are taking a deep dive into the Assyrian Empire. But the notes we have, they approach this ancient superpower from a completely unexpected angle.
Oh, completely. It's such a unique framing.
Yeah, the author of these notes analyzes Assyria through the lens of a modern psychological archetype. This specific subpersonality that they refer to as Liz.
Which I love, by the way, because it just completely shatters that usual, museum glass distance we tend to have with ancient history.
Right. It makes it feel immediate.
Exactly. And to be clear for you listening, Liz is not an actual historical figure. She is a psychological construct used in these notes to represent a very specific type of energy.
Like a vibe.
Yeah, a very intense vibe. The notes define the Liz archetype as someone who represents just absolute curated presence. She's characterized by unapologetic dominance, strict aesthetic control, and just a terrifying apex predator mentality.
Apex predator is the perfect way to describe it. Because when you read the description of Liz, you immediately picture this hyper-successful, deeply calculating anti-heroine.
Oh yeah, you know the type.
Totally. The notes say this personality values independence, she craves social status and admiration, but she manages her stress and shapes her outcomes through sheer performance.
Right.
Like she doesn't just want to win. She wants everyone to watch her win, admire her outfit while she does it, and basically be absolutely terrified to ever cross her. It is pure, unadulterated, eat or be eaten energy.
And the core mission of our discussion today is to essentially overlay that psychological profile onto an entire civilization.
Which is such a wild concept.
It is. We're going to explore how millions of people, these sprawling urban centers, and massive technologically advanced armies operated collectively as this image-conscious, calculating apex predator.
Yeah.
We're going to look at how the Assyrians turned the raw exercise of power into a highly theatrical performance, how they managed the logistics of that terror, and what their eventual catastrophic downfall teaches us about the absolute limits of ruling through fear.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because you don't just, you don't wake up one day as a civilization and decide, hey, I'm going to become the most terrifying entity on the planet.
There's always a catalyst.
Right. To understand how Assyria adopted this Liz persona, we have to look at the forces that molded them. We really have to look at the map. I mean, geography is usually the unseen hand that writes history, right?
Geography is absolutely the crucible. So to locate the Assyrian heartland, you need to picture northern Mesopotamia. If you're looking at a modern map, we are talking about northern Iraq, stretching up into parts of neighboring Syria and southeastern Turkey. This is where their great cities arose. Places like Ashur, Nineveh, Nimrud, Khorsabad.
Now, when people hear Mesopotamia, I feel like they usually picture the Deep South.
Almost always.
Yeah, they picture the Tigris and Euphrates rivers emptying into the Persian Gulf, ancient Sumer, Babylon, marshlands, and just, thick mud. But the environment up north where the Assyrians actually were is structurally very different, isn't it?
It's wildly different. So the southern environment is dominated by alluvium.
Which is what, exactly?
It's that incredibly fertile, fine-grained soil that gets deposited by the rivers flooding over thousands of years. It's a flat, muddy landscape, highly productive, but also somewhat insulated.
Okay.
Assyria, being situated further north, occupied a zone that offered a real mixed blessing. I mean, they did have river valleys, and their access to the upper Tigris River meant they could sustain large-scale grain agriculture. They even enjoyed slightly more reliable rainfall than those southern cities.
Which means they could grow food, generate wealth, build cities. So they were doing pretty well for themselves.
Oh, they could generate massive wealth. But here is the critical geographical distinction. It's about what surrounded them. Unlike the Deep South or, a place like Egypt, which is practically a fortress protected by massive deserts on both sides.
Right. Egypt had it easy defensively.
Exactly. The Assyrian homeland was completely exposed, just totally wide open. They were surrounded by open plains, low hills, and the margins of the steppe.
So no natural walls,
None.
no mountain ranges boxing them in safely, no massive oceans protecting their flanks, just open air.
Zero natural defenses. They were permanently, terrifyingly exposed to multiple invasion routes. I mean, a hostile force could pour down from the Zagros Mountains to the east.
Yeah.
Nomadic tribes could just sweep in from the western plains. Rival kingdoms could march up from the southern river valleys or down from the Anatolian plateaus in the north.
Wow, so literally from every single direction.
Every direction. And because Assyria was agriculturally productive and wealthy, they were an incredibly attractive target.
Like a bank sitting in the middle of an open field with no locks.
Precisely. But because they had no geographical borders to hide behind, security ceased to be just a mere policy issue. It became an existential obsession for them.
You read about that kind of 360-degree vulnerability, and it just makes complete psychological sense why they developed the way they did.
Oh, absolutely.
It's not a perfect comparison, but it reminds me of a dynamic you see in sociology sometimes. Imagine a kid who grows up in a profoundly rough, chaotic neighborhood.
Right.
This kid realizes very early on that there is no fence around their yard, the door doesn't lock, and they're basically surrounded by people who might victimize them at any given moment.
The environment forces a behavioral adaptation. You have to change to survive.
Right. And some kids might just hide. They might try to stay out of sight. But others decide that the only way to ensure they are never the victim is to become the absolute most terrifying, unpredictable, hypervigilant person on the entire block.
Yes.
They adopt this posture of overwhelming, disproportionate aggression. They hit first, and they hit so hard that nobody even contemplates looking in their direction.
Yeah.
They have to project this aura of invincibility because showing even a millimeter of weakness means destruction.
That translates perfectly to the geopolitical posture of the Assyrian state. Their geography decisively shaped their psychology.
It's fascinating.
In that specific, highly exposed environment, mere survival required treating the control of surrounding territory as inseparable from their right to exist.
Because if they don't control it, someone else will use it against them.
Exactly. Just sitting behind city walls and farming wasn't going to ensure their survival. They needed forward operating bases. They needed to control the mountain passes before the enemy could even march through them.
Proactive defense.
Yes. And this demanded extreme military vigilance and a highly mobile army.
But wait, let me push back on this a little bit.
Sure.
If a civilization's foundational trauma is this profound, inescapable lack of natural borders, does their aggressive expansion ever actually satiate that fear?
That's the big question.
Right. Or does it just create a continually expanding perimeter of paranoia?
Yeah.
I mean, mathematically, if you conquer your immediate neighbors to create a buffer zone, well, now your borders are touching their neighbors.
Yes.
So do you just have to keep conquering outward forever?
That is the ultimate tragedy of the Assyrian state model. It became a self-feeding, unquenchable loop.
Wow.
To protect their vulnerable core, they felt absolutely compelled to control the immediate buffer zones. But once they occupied those zones, well, those zones became part of the state.
So now they have to protect the new borders.
Which meant they now had to protect the regions beyond the new buffer zones. They developed in a world where organized force wasn't merely a defensive tool. It became their primary mode of interaction with the entire world.
Which provides the perfect bridge to how they physically and politically structured their society to manage this permanent state of paranoia.
Right.
Because a society organized entirely around proactive aggression requires a very specific type of internal engine. And this is really where that Liz identity from the source material begins to manifest.
Oh, undeniably.
Because the architecture of their power wasn't just functional, it was deeply, deeply theatrical.
It was. To grasp this, you have to examine the role of the Assyrian king, particularly as the state evolved into its later imperial form.
Okay.
This was a centralized monarchy taken to its absolute extreme. The king was not just a politician. He was the supreme military commander, the ultimate judge, the chief administrator, and the primary builder of infrastructure.
A total micromanager.
Yes, but most importantly, he was the earthly representative of the divine order.
Representing their national god, Ashur. Right.
Yes. Now, it is important to distinguish this from the Egyptian model, just for context.
Right, because pharaohs were gods.
Exactly. Many Egyptian pharaohs claimed to be literal living gods on earth. The Assyrian kings generally did not claim that. They were mortals.
Okay, so they bled like everyone else.
Right. However, their authority was inextricably fused with the religious structure. The king was the high priest and the appointed manager of Ashur's earthly estate.
The CEO of Ashur's Incorporated.
Basically. Therefore, when the king decided to march an army into a neighboring kingdom, it was never framed in the official records as a political land grab or, a fight over copper resources.
Of course not.
It was always presented as a sacred duty. It was a literal extension of divine will.
This is where those Liz traits fit so uncannily well. If you look back at the psychological profile in the notes, Liz is obsessed with aesthetic dominance, admiration, and social status.
Yes.
Liz doesn't just want to quietly defeat a rival behind closed doors. She wants the victory to be spectacular. She wants to look flawless while she does it. She wants you to know she did it, and she wants you to admire her supremacy even while you're absolutely terrified of her.
The concept of power as performance is so central here. Assyria mirrored this perfectly.
Yeah.
I mean, they possessed overwhelming, brute violence, yes, but they elevated that violence into a theatrical production.
The show.
A terrifying show. Their colossal palace architecture, the incredibly detailed royal iconography, the meticulously choreographed public punishments, it all served a psychological purpose.
Right.
They turned the concept of their empire into a performance of sheer crushing inevitability. They demanded to be seen, feared, and admired simultaneously.
The source material dives into their cosmological worldview, too, and I found this part completely fascinating.
It's so different from how we think today.
It really is.
Yeah.
The Assyrian belief system held that the universe is inherently ordered, but that this divine order is incredibly fragile.
Yes, very delicate.
Like chaos is always just clawing at the edges of the world, trying to tear it all down. So it becomes the king's literal sacred duty to defeat chaos and restore the balance.
Right.
In this framework, expanding the empire isn't just imperialism. Conquest equals divine order.
It creates a convenient moral imperative for endless war.
Right, exactly. But I have to ask, are we taking their propaganda a little too literally here?
How so?
Well, did these kings actually believe they were doing the necessary divine work for Ashur by keeping the cosmos in balance? Or was this just a highly convenient, super cynical marketing campaign cooked up by smart politicians to justify stealing their neighbor's land, taking their grain, and enriching themselves?
It's a fair question.
I mean, humans haven't changed that much, have they? We still use high-minded ideals to justify resource grabs today.
It is so tempting for the modern mind to separate religion from political propaganda, but we have to remember that in the ancient Mesopotamian context, that distinction simply did not exist.
Really? No separation at all?
None. The fusion of aesthetics, governance, and religious truth was absolute. To understand them, you have to understand their ontology. They genuinely viewed the universe as a highly dangerous place, teeming with chaotic, malevolent forces. And crucially, they did not have a concept of a morally rewarding afterlife waiting to make everything right in the end.
Oh, right. Their version of the afterlife was pretty bleak, wasn't it?
Extremely bleak. For the ancient Mesopotamians, the afterlife was universally imagined as a dim, dusty, shadowy underworld.
Yikes.
Regardless of whether you were a great king or a lowly servant, you all ended up eating dust in the dark.
So all the stakes are entirely in the present tense.
All the stakes are in the physical world. The present was the only place where order could be maintained, and it had to be fiercely, physically maintained.
Wow.
So when an Assyrian king marches his army out to crush a rebellion, burn a city, and drag its wealth back to Nineveh, he is actively proving that Ashur is strong and that chaos is being successfully held at bay.
So the wealth isn't just money, it's evidence.
The material wealth gained is the literal physical proof of divine favor. It isn't cynical to them at all.
That blows my mind.
The military and economic success of the empire was the living evidence that their religious worldview was factually correct. If Ashur were weak, they would be defeated. Because they were winning, Ashur was supreme.
Okay, that makes sense. It's a completely closed loop of logic.
Precisely.
But if you were going to operate as this glamorous, terrifying, cosmic Liz figure on the world stage, you have to find a way to pay for that lifestyle.
Oh, it wasn't cheap.
Not at all. You cannot maintain an empire of colossal, stone-carved palaces, massive standing armies, and relentless military campaigns on good vibes and intimidation alone.
No, you need hard assets.
That level of performance is incredibly expensive.
Yeah.
Which brings us to the actual mechanics of their power, the economy of extraction.
Right. Every machine requires fuel, and the Assyrian machine was massive.
So where did it start?
The foundation of their economy started out the same way as most others in the ancient Near East, with agriculture. They relied heavily on the cultivation of barley and wheat, the raising of livestock, and the maintenance of orchards.
Okay, the basic.
Yeah. But because of their geographical position, that same exposure that made them paranoid, they also sat squarely at a crucial crossroads.
Ah, trade routes.
Exactly. This made them natural facilitators for trade networks moving goods between Anatolia in the north, the Levant to the west, Babylonia to the south, and Iran to the east.
But the notes make a very clear point that as they transitioned into the Neo-Assyrian period, they didn't just rely on what they could grow in the dirt or trade with merchants.
No, they got much more aggressive.
Yeah, they built an economy based heavily on extraction. They extracted tribute from conquered peoples, levied heavy taxes, hoarded war booty, and utilized immense amounts of corvée labor.
And corvée labor is a crucial mechanism to understand here.
Let's define that because it's a weird term.
For a modern listener, think of it as paying your taxes not from your bank account, but with your physical sweat and your calendar.
Oh, man.
Instead of handing over a portion of your wealth, you owed the state a certain number of months of forced labor every year.
So if you are a farmer, the state just shows up and says, congratulations for the next 3 months. You aren't farming. You are walking to a quarry, cutting massive blocks of stone, dragging them across the desert, and building the king's new wall.
Precisely. And if you didn't do it, the punishments were severe.
Like flaying.
Like flaying. This gave the Assyrian state access to a nearly limitless pool of manpower to construct their monumental architecture and maintain their infrastructure.
Which feeds right back into the Liz aesthetic.
Exactly. But beyond corvée labor, we really have to discuss their policy of mass deportation, which is arguably one of their most brutal and historically impactful innovations.
The notes detail this, and it is chillingly clinical.
It's horrifying.
When the Assyrians conquered a region, they didn't just leave the existing population in place, install a governor, and ask for an annual tribute check. They engaged in the mass relocation of entire societies.
They would uproot tens of thousands of people at a single time.
Just unroot them completely.
Yes. They would march them hundreds of miles away from their ancestral homelands and resettle them wherever the state needed human capital.
Wow.
If they were building a brand new capital city, they needed laborers, artisans, and farmers to feed those laborers. So they would simply import an entire conquered population to do it.
The analogy that came to mind when reading this is a ruthless, modern corporate buyout.
Oh, that's a great comparison.
Imagine a massive, aggressive conglomerate acquiring a smaller competitor. You don't just buy the company and let the existing teams keep working together in their old office.
Yeah, they clean house.
Right. The parent company acquires them, immediately fires the leadership, takes the remaining staff, and scatters them across entirely different branch offices in different states.
The mechanics of the strategy are remarkably similar, because in both cases, the primary goal is to sever existing loyalties and prevent organization.
Exactly. You bring up the teams so they can't unionize or coordinate a revolt. You force them to learn the parent company's culture, and you squeeze every possible ounce of efficiency out of them.
Yeah.
The Assyrians were basically doing corporate restructuring, but with human lives.
And by uprooting people and placing them in a completely foreign environment, surrounded by people who spoke different languages and worshiped different gods, the Assyrians effectively destroyed local nationalism.
Because you can't rebel if you don't even speak the same language as your neighbor.
Right. A disoriented population is much less likely to organize an armed rebellion. But simultaneously, it knitted this massive empire together through forced demographic engineering. They were essentially homogenizing the Near East.
But this raises a huge logistical question for me.
Okay.
How do you rule people you do not know who speak different languages across distances you cannot personally see We are talking about the ancient world.
It's a massive terror.
You don't have the internet, you don't have satellite surveillance, you don't have telephones, you just have guys on horses and chunks of clay. How did they maintain this level of micromanagement?
The Assyrian answer to the problem of distance was an incredibly advanced bureaucratic machine, backed, of course, by the constant threat of violence.
Right, the stick is always there.
Always. But they pioneered an imperial model that proved incredibly durable. We are talking about a highly sophisticated, cuneiform administration.
Lots of paperwork. Or clay work.
Lots of clay work. The state kept detailed royal annals. Provincial governors managed local records, they tracked tax obligations, and they maintained a massive network of surveillance and espionage.
And to make that surveillance network function, they had to build physical infrastructure, right?
Absolutely. They couldn't rely on rugged terrain to send spies back and forth. They engineered canals, laid down paved roads, and perhaps most impressively, they instituted a state communication system known as the Kaliu.
The Kaliu. What is that?
It was essentially a highly organized relay system for imperial messengers.
How fast could information actually travel on this relay system? Correct. Because I'm picturing a guy just riding a horse for weeks.
Oh, it was unprecedented speeds for the ancient world. They established way stations every 20 to 30 miles along the main roads.
Okay.
A rider would come galloping into a station, totally exhausted, carrying a clay tablet enclosed in a clay envelope with the king's seal.
The clay envelope. That's so cool.
It is, and he would immediately hand that envelope to a fresh rider waiting on a fresh horse who would take off instantly toward the next station.
Like the Pony Express.
Exactly like the Pony Express.
Yeah.
By keeping the horses fresh, a message could travel hundreds of miles in a matter of days.
So if a provincial governor on the edge of the empire started plotting a rebellion, a spy could put a message on the relay system, and the king in Nineveh would know about it before the governor even had time to gather his troops.
That speed of information was terrifying to their enemies. It proved that an empire could function as a literal, well-oiled machine. It prioritized efficiency and the elimination of unnecessary friction. And as the notes point out, achieving the maximum outcome with the most efficient, calculated use of energy is another core characteristic of the Liz persona.
Okay, so we've looked at the machinery of the state. We've examined the business model of extraction and deportation. Now, we really need to meet the individuals who actually sat at the helm of this operation.
The CEOs of the empire.
Exactly. Because a machine of that scale, a surveillance state that aggressive, doesn't just run on autopilot. It requires a highly specific type of psychology at the absolute top to keep the gears turning and the terror fresh.
It absolutely does.
When you look at the roster of Assyrian rulers, you are looking at the ultimate living manifestations of that Liz archetype.
The notes highlight 5 major kings from the Neo-Assyrian period who truly defined the empire's trajectory.
Let's go through them.
To understand the evolution of their power, we have to start with Ashurbanipal II, who ruled from 883 to 859 BCE. He is widely considered the architect of the Neo-Assyrian Empire. He took a strong regional state and transformed it into a relentlessly aggressive, expansionist superpower.
He's the one who built the brand new capital city at Nimrud, right?
He did. He poured immense resources into Nimrud, throwing a legendary multi-day banquet for tens of thousands of people just to celebrate its completion.
What a flex.
A massive flex. But historically, what Ashurbanipal II is most known for is officially systematizing terror as a tool of statecraft.
The notes are pretty graphic about this.
They are.
He used public executions, mass punishments, and he specifically favored flaying his enemies alive. And the craziest part is that he wasn't subtle about it.
No, he wanted everyone to know.
He didn't do it in the shadows and try to hide it from the history books. He actively bragged about it. He commissioned artists to carve detailed, life-size images of these flayings and executions into the stone walls of his palace.
Think about the psychological purpose of that. Why take the time to meticulously carve an image of a man being skinned alive? Because it is a permanent visual broadcast of consequence.
Yeah.
To the Assyrian core, Ashurbanipal II was the heroic restorer of divine order. He was securing the borders and bringing wealth home. To everyone else on the periphery, he was a literal waking nightmare.
It's the ultimate Liz move. Like, I'm going to destroy you, and then I'm going to make the story of your destruction the wallpaper in my dining room so everyone who visits knows exactly who is in charge.
That leads us directly to the next major figure, his son Shalmaneser III, who ruled from 859 to 824 BCE.
Okay, what was his deal?
Shalmaneser took the terrifying foundation his father built and used it to expand the empire's reach significantly. We might categorize him as the diplomat dominator.
Diplomat dominator. I like that.
He conducted dozens of military campaigns, but he also knew how to use the threat of his father's violence to extract submission without always having to actually fight.
The notes mention the Black Obelisk in connection with him. What is that?
Yes. The Black Obelisk of Shalmaneser III is one of the most famous archaeological discoveries from this entire era. It is a massive limestone monument, and what makes it extraordinary is the imagery carved into it.
What does it show?
It explicitly depicts foreign rulers bringing tribute to the Assyrian king.
Including King Jehu of Israel, right?
Yes, exactly.
The notes say the carving shows him literally bowing down, face pressed to the dirt, kneeling like an obedient mouse in front of Shalmaneser.
That is exactly what it shows. It is an absolute masterpiece of imperial propaganda.
Wow.
It isn't just a ledger of taxes collected. It is the physical codification of hierarchy. It demonstrates the world order revolves entirely around the Assyrian king.
Fast forward a bit, and we get to Sargon II, who ruled from 722 to 705 BCE. And his story is fascinating because he wasn't the designated heir, was he?
No, he was a usurper who seized power in a coup.
Right. And his name, Sargon, it translates roughly to the legitimate king, which is exactly the kind of name you choose when you are incredibly insecure about your right to the throne.
It's a bit on the nose.
A little bit. Sargon II needed to prove his legitimacy quickly and violently. The notes say he completed the conquest of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BCE, which resulted in the mass deportation of the Israelites, often referred to as the 10 Lost Tribes.
A massive historical event.
Yeah. And to further cement his brand, he decides that living in the existing capital just isn't good enough for him. He builds a brand new, entirely custom capital city from scratch called Dur-Shurukin, or Khorsabad.
Right.
He builds this massive, perfect architectural manifestation of his own ego. But here is the question I have about Sargon II.
Go for it.
The notes say that he died in battle, which is a huge omen of bad luck. And almost immediately after his death, this magnificent custom city was basically abandoned by his successor.
It was almost entirely abandoned. The court moved back to Nineveh.
So doesn't that prove that this entire powers performance system, this whole Liz aesthetic, was actually deeply fragile?
How do you mean?
If a king can build an entire city just for his personal brand, and the second he dies, the aesthetic completely evaporates and the city is left to rot, doesn't that show how precarious the system was? It relied completely on the terrifying charisma of a single individual.
It certainly highlights a specific vulnerability in personal autocratic rule.
Yep.
The aesthetic of Sargon's reign was fragile, yes.
Okay.
However, the Assyrian bureaucratic machine itself survived his death seamlessly.
The paperwork kept flowing.
Exactly. The system adapted, elevated his son, and kept extracting taxes. What Sargon's abandoned city really teaches us is a profound lesson about the nature of ancient history.
Which is?
History is not an objective narrative of heroes versus villains. As the notes so brilliantly summarize, heroes are often just successful rulers who crushed resistance and commanded enough labor to build cities. Villains are usually just the perspective of the defeated populations.
History is memory curated by power. That is a line from the notes that really stuck with me.
It's a great line.
Sargon asked himself, does building this city work for me right now to establish my power? And for his reign, it did. What happened after he died just wasn't his problem.
And the curation of memory brings us to the next ruler, Sennacherib, who ruled from 704 to 681 BCE.
He's the one who abandoned Sargon's city, right?
Yes, and he moved the capital to Nineveh. Sennacherib was an engineering visionary. He created massive, complex water systems, aqueducts, and canals to supply Nineveh, transforming it into an absolute masterpiece of an ancient metropolis.
But his legacy is incredibly dark because of what he did to Babylon.
He destroyed it.
Just leveled it.
Utterly. And we need to pause and explain why this was such a shocking act, even by the incredibly brutal standards of the ancient Near East.
Yeah, because they destroyed cities all the time. Why was Babylon different?
Babylon wasn't just another rival city-state. Babylon was a deeply revered cultural, intellectual, and religious center. It shared ancient language roots, literary traditions, and a pantheon of gods with Assyria.
Like a sister city, almost.
Yes. Destroying Babylon was akin to a modern superpower, destroying a universally sacred site like Rome or Mecca. It was a massive taboo.
So why did he do it? Why cross that line?
Because Babylon was constantly rebelling, they refused to submit quietly to Assyrian rule. After dealing with multiple uprisings, Sennacherib essentially decided he was just tired of playing politics.
He snapped.
He marched in, sacked the city, destroyed the temples, and even diverted water over the ruins to physically wash it away.
Wow.
It sent a shockwave of absolute horror through the ancient world. It showed that the Assyrian king was willing to shatter even the most deeply held sacred norms just to maintain control.
Which is terrifying.
Very.
And finally, rounding out the major players, we have Ashurbanipal, who ruled from 668 to 627 BCE. The notes describe him as a paradox.
He really is.
He's the scholar king and the hunter king.
He is arguably the most complex of the Assyrian rulers. On one hand, he was highly educated. He famously claimed he could read complex Sumerian texts and solve advanced mathematical problems.
A real intellectual.
Yes. He commanded the construction of the Great Library of Nineveh, sending agents across the empire to confiscate or copy every significant clay tablet they could find.
Right. And thanks to his obsession with archiving, we actually have preserved texts like the Epic of Gilgamesh today.
Exactly. So he's a librarian.
But he's also an apex predator.
Very much so. His palace reliefs are famous for depicting him engaged in royal lion hunts. The lion hunt was a highly ritualized display of the king's power over the chaotic forces of nature. He would stand in a chariot and shoot lions that had been released from cages specifically for him to kill.
So books in one hand, dying lions in the other.
He perfectly encapsulates the dual nature of Assyria at its absolute zenith. He oversaw the cultural and territorial peak of the empire. He even briefly conquered parts of Egypt.
Wow.
But by doing so, he pushed the empire into massive geopolitical overstretch. He drained the treasury and exhausted the military. He represents both the peak and the beginning of the end.
Which transitions us perfectly to the world stage. These kings were all playing a high-stakes game of geopolitical chess.
Definitely.
If the kings were the ultimate Liz predators, how did they interact with the rest of the nations and their ecosystem?
Well, they did not do friendship.
No alliance.
The concept of an equal permanent alliance in the modern democratic sense simply did not exist in their foreign policy. Their entire geopolitical strategy can be summarized in one doctrine: convert potential threats into paying vassals.
Let's define a vassal state for a moment, just to be clear on the mechanics.
A vassal state is a kingdom that is technically allowed to maintain its own local king, its own local gods, and its own internal laws.
Okay, so they still have some autonomy.
On paper. However, in exchange for not being utterly destroyed by the Assyrian army, the vassal king must swear an oath of absolute loyalty to Assyria, provide troops when requested, and pay a massive annual tribute of gold, silver, grain, or exotic goods.
So the Assyrian policy is basically, you can keep your throne, but only if you pay for our lunch and publicly kiss the ring.
That's it, exactly.
It was about using the threat of violence as deterrence, which saves the empire the cost of actually having to occupy every single territory with their own soldiers. As the notes put it so sharply, stay useful or become a warning.
And they had serious, powerful rivals they had to constantly manage or suppress.
Like who?
We already discussed Babylon to the south, which was this complicated, restive cultural sibling. To the north, they faced Urartu, a formidable mountainous kingdom situated around modern-day Armenia.
Okay.
Urartu controlled vital trade routes for metals and horses, and their mountain fortresses made them incredibly difficult to conquer. For a long time, they were a genuine military equal to Assyria.
The notes also mention Elam to the east.
Elam, located in what is now southwestern Iran, was a persistent thorn in Assyria's side.
How so?
Whenever Babylon decided to rebel against Assyrian control, Elam was usually the one secretly funding the rebellion or providing safe harbor to the rebels.
Funding proxy wars.
Exactly. Ashurbanipal ultimately grew so frustrated with their interference that he marched in and utterly devastated Elam, practically wiping them from the geopolitical map.
When you look at the major conflicts of this era, you can really see how the rest of the world desperately tried to cope with this aggressive expansion. The notes point out the Battle of Karkor in 853 BCE.
Karkor is a fascinating moment in history. It was one of the earliest recorded instances of a massive multi-state coalition.
Like an ancient NATO.
Kind of. 12 different kings from the Levant, including kings from Damascus, Israel, and various Phoenician city-states. They put aside their own bitter rivalries and banded together to form a combined army just to survive the Assyrian advance.
The enemy of my terrifying enemy is my friend.
Exactly. They managed to fight the Assyrians to a standstill. temporarily halting their westward expansion. But Assyria was relentless. They just kept coming back year after year until the coalition eventually fractured.
But the conflict that really brings the psychological warfare of the Assyrians into stark focus is the siege of Lachish in 701 BCE. The notes focus on this heavily, and I want to really dig into the mechanics of what happened here.
It is perhaps the most well-documented siege in ancient history. Lachish was the second most important city in the Kingdom of Judah, right after Jerusalem.
Okay.
Judah had rebelled against King Sennacherib, refusing to pay their tribute. In response, Sennacherib marched his army into the Levant and systematically dismantled the kingdom, trapping the Judahite forces inside the fortified city of Lachish.
Let's explain how an ancient siege actually worked, because it wasn't just, starving people out. The Assyrians were aggressive engineers.
They absolutely were. Lachish was built on a steep hill with massive stone walls. The Assyrians didn't just wait outside. They ordered their engineers to construct an enormous siege ramp.
Like a literal hill made of dirt.
Literally moving thousands of tons of dirt and stone to build an artificial hill right up to the enemy walls.
While the defenders are standing on the wall shooting arrows and throwing boiling liquids down at them.
Yes. And once the ramp was completed, the Assyrians rolled up their siege engines.
What do those look like?
These were essentially massive, armored wooden tanks with long battering rams inside, covered in wet leather so the defenders couldn't set them on fire.
Wow.
They pounded the walls until they breached. They had sappers tunneling under the foundations. The military precision was just overwhelming. They took the city, slaughtered the defenders, and deported the survivors.
And this is where the Liz concept, the aestheticization of brutality, reaches its absolute peak.
Oh, completely.
Because after they burn the city, Sennacherib goes back to his capital at Nineveh, and what does he do?
He commissions his master artisans to create a series of massive, exquisitely detailed stone reliefs depicting the entire siege from start to finish.
Like a graphic novel carved in stone.
Exactly. We were talking about wall panels that stretch across entire rooms in his palace. They show the siege ramps, the battering rams, the captives being marched into exile, and the rebel leaders being impaled on stakes.
And where does he put these carvings?
He installs them in a specific room in his palace, the exact room where visiting foreign diplomats and vassal kings were made to wait before being granted an audience with him.
That is next-level psychological warfare.
It's brilliant and evil.
You are a diplomat from a small kingdom. You are waiting to see the king to negotiate your tribute payments, and while you wait, you are staring at a life-sized, high-definition stone carving of what happens when a city decides not to pay its tribute.
Yep.
It's designed to make you give up before the battle even starts. It reminds me of the corporate buyout analogy again.
But how so?
It's like a CEO hanging a framed picture of a bankrupt, destitute competitor in the lobby just to set the tone for the meeting. Sign the contract or become the next painting.
It reshaped the rules of international interaction. Diplomacy ceased to be a negotiation between peers. It became an exercise in intimidation. Alliances were purely about leverage.
Right.
But, up to this point, we have been looking at this from a very high altitude. We are talking about kings, vast armies, rival empires. We need to shift our focus to the ground level.
Right. Because not everyone is an emperor or a foreign diplomat staring at a wall carving.
Yeah.
What was it actually like for the average person living inside this magnificent, terrifying machine?
It was a very different experience.
We have talked about daily life and the internal realities of the empire.
The notes draw a very sharp contrast between urban life and rural life.
Okay, let's start with urban.
If you were living in a major imperial capital like Nineveh or Nimrud, you were existing in a monumental, highly controlled environment. These cities were vast. Nineveh had massive defensive walls, towering ziggurats, sprawling palaces.
Very cosmopolitan.
Extremely. The markets were filled with imported luxury goods, ivory from Africa, cedar from Lebanon, metals from Anatolia. But it was also a heavily militarized zone. There were soldiers everywhere, and you were under constant surveillance.
Whereas rural life, for the vast majority of the population, was a completely different reality.
Oh, completely. For the rural farmer, life revolved around the relentless cycles of planting and harvesting. The society was highly stratified and deeply patriarchal.
What were they eating?
The daily diet was pretty much subsistence level. Barley bread, onion, garlic, dates, and beer. Meat was a rare luxury, largely reserved for the elite or special festivals. And looming over all of this was the heavy burden of state obligations. You were always one bad harvest away from ruin, and always under the threat of being conscripted for war, or selected for the next mass deportation.
So, considering that crushing burden, I have to ask the obvious question here.
Go ahead.
Did the average farmer actually buy into this grand Liz performance of divine cosmic order? Did they really believe the king was holding back the forces of chaos, or were they just keeping their heads down, drinking their beer, and praying king's tax collector wouldn't notice them this year?
It is a complex mix, but what the historical evidence suggests is that over generations, the population largely internalized the hierarchy.
Really, they accepted it.
You have to remember they didn't have access to alternative narratives. You were constantly surrounded by visual and religious propaganda, reinforcing the idea that Ashur was supreme.
Right, there's no underground newspaper.
Exactly. Assyria didn't just control physical actions, they controlled the boundaries of what people believed was possible. Rebellion seemed mathematically and cosmically impossible.
But the notes also point out that there were hidden benefits to living inside the machine. It wasn't purely misery.
That is a really important nuance. The empire was incredibly burdensome, yes, but it also provided unprecedented stability.
The Pax Assyriaca.
Precisely. They built safe roads that allowed trade to flourish. They instituted standardized legal systems and weights and measures which made markets reliable.
Okay.
And ironically, through their brutal policy of forced deportations, they inadvertently created a highly diverse, multi-ethnic society. By mixing different cultures, languages, and artisanal traditions together in the capital cities, they drove a massive surge in technological and artistic innovation.
And as we mentioned earlier with Ashurbanipal's library, their absolute obsession with controlling information resulted in the preservation of massive amounts of Mesopotamian knowledge that otherwise would have been lost to history entirely.
It was a protective, highly structured, but incredibly heavy duality. You were safe from outside invasion, but you were entirely at the mercy of the state.
But history shows us that every apex predator eventually meets its match. No empire lasts forever.
They never do.
Which brings us to the final act of the story, the fatal flaw and the spectacular fall of the Assyrian Empire.
Oh.
Because their greatest strength, their terrifying, hyper-efficient control, ultimately guaranteed their own destruction.
The structural fragility of the Assyrian model was immense, and it was baked into the system from the very beginning.
Going back to geography.
Exactly. Remember our discussion about their exposed borders. The system required constant military expansion to feed the economic machine and to maintain that perimeter of fear.
But you cannot expand forever. You run out of runway.
You reach a mathematical limit. Eventually, the borders became too vast to effectively defend, even with those rapid relay systems. They suffered from severe geopolitical overstretch. By conquering so many diverse peoples and relying so heavily on terror and deportation, they generated a deep, simmering, universal resentment. Virtually everyone they had conquered was just waiting for a moment of weakness.
And that moment of weakness came from inside the palace.
As it usually does. After the death of Ashurbanipal, the empire was consumed by a series of brutal succession crises.
The war.
Yes. The royal family began fighting itself, which forced them to recall troops from the borders to fight in the capital. The periphery saw the weakness, and the rebellion began.
And the dam finally breaks in 612 BCE.
612 BCE is one of the most pivotal dates in ancient history. A massive coalition formed against them.
Who was in it?
The Babylonians from the south, who had never forgotten the destruction of their sacred city, they joined forces with the Medes from the eastern mountains, along with Scythians and other groups.
A super coalition.
This combined force marched on Nineveh. They laid siege to the greatest city in the world, breached its walls, and burned it to the ground with such ferocity that the empire effectively ceased to exist.
The suddenness of it is staggering.
Yeah.
But what I find to be the most deeply ironic part of this entire story, the source notes highlight this beautifully, is that the Assyrians essentially open-sourced their own destruction.
How do you mean?
By being so relentlessly aggressive, they forced all their enemies to evolve.
Ah.
Right. If you were a smaller kingdom facing Assyria, you couldn't fight them the old-fashioned way. You had to learn Assyrian military tactics.
Yeah, to adapt.
You had to learn how to form massive multi-state coalitions, coordinate logistics, and build siege engines just to survive. Assyria built the blueprint for organized imperial warfare, forced their neighbors to study it, and then got completely outplayed by the very weapon they created.
That is a brilliant synthesis. And if we connect this to the bigger picture, it delivers the final definitive verdict on the Liz doctrine.
Which is?
Assyria optimized entirely for aesthetic dominance and physical control. But they completely neglected the softer, yet far more durable elements of statecraft.
Like sustainability.
Sustainability, loyalty, and flexibility. Fear is a powerful motivator in the short term, but it is incredibly expensive to maintain. If you make too many enemies and you offer them absolutely no incentive to stay loyal other than the threat of being flayed, eventually they will coordinate and overwhelm you.
The empires that followed them seem to have learned that lesson, didn't they?
They absolutely did. The Neo-Babylonian Empire, which rose immediately from the ashes of Assyria, relied a bit less on raw, broadcasted terror and leaned heavily into cultural and architectural prestige to maintain loyalty.
And then the Persians came along.
And a few generations later, the Persian Empire perfected the synthesis. The Persians kept all the brilliant administrative systems the Assyrians had invented, the paved roads, the provincial governors, the relay communication networks, but they deliberately dropped the extreme brutality.
Right, they were much more tolerant.
They allowed conquered peoples to keep their local religions and rebuild their temples. The Persians learned that while fear works, tolerance and mutual economic benefit generate a far more durable loyalty.
So, to summarize this incredible journey through the source material, Assyria wasn't just a brutal, dusty footnote in an ancient history textbook.
Not at all.
They were a deeply organized, aesthetically brilliant, hyper-paranoid civilization that fundamentally reshaped how human power operates on a large scale.
They really were the blueprint.
They proved that if you can perfectly control the narrative, build an inescapable bureaucratic system, and weaponize your aesthetic, you don't actually need to be liked by anyone. You just need to be remembered.
They were the ancient world's ultimate apex predator. They tore down the old world order and left behind a blueprint for statecraft, administration, and psychological warfare that echoes through literally every empire that followed them.
And that leaves me with one final thought for you, the listener, to mull over long after this deep dive ends.
Oh, this is the scary part.
It is. The Assyrians perfected the art of mass surveillance, the strategic breaking of social bonds through relocation, and the use of highly visible, carefully curated propaganda to make resistance feel mathematically impossible.
Yeah.
When you look at the landscape of the world today, what modern institutions, what massive multinational corporations, or even what inescapable digital platforms are secretly running the exact same Assyrian playbook right now without us even realizing it?
That is a chilling thought.
Think about that the next time you find yourself scrolling through a perfectly curated, inescapable feed that basically demands your attention. Thank you for joining us in this deep dive into the architecture of power. Keep questioning the narratives around you, and we'll catch you next time.